Okay, YouTube is taking a minute. Okay, and we're live. So hello, everyone. Thank you for coming and spending a Friday here with us, whether that be live in the Zoom room, watching any of the live streams on Facebook or YouTube, or watching the recording afterwards. We're super excited to have Dr. Prince here today from the University of Victoria to tell us a little bit more about what disability models are, what they entail, and kind of just to learn more about them. As you can see, I kind of need this lesson because I don't know enough to give this introduction, but I'm excited to hand it off to him.
Thank you, Angela. And it's a delight to be here today. And I appreciate this is being recorded, and there'll be an opportunity to live stream it and see it on Facebook or other, maybe YouTube, I guess. So, and thank you, Angela, for being my slide changer and presenter and organizer too. Thank you. So anyways, it's a treat to be being part of this workshop series that's put on by ConnecTogether Society and their association with the Disability Foundation based in Vancouver. And I'm coming today from their traditional territories of the Algonquin speaking peoples on Vancouver Island. I live on unceded traditional ancestral territories of Indigenous peoples today known as the Esquimalt and the Songhees First Nations, and I acknowledge that with respect and gratitude. So, Angela contacted me, I guess, a couple of months ago and said, would I be interested in giving a talk? And she had come across some talk I'd given, I guess, a few years ago on models of disability. And I went, oh, that was intriguing. And so the subtitle is Reimagining What is Possible, which I think I got off the website of ConnecTogether Society. So which I thought was a great idea, because one of the purposes of talking about models of disability is to understand how people historically and in the current times of today think about or imagine what disability is about, how we talk about people with disabilities, and think about policies and services and programs that may help assist people with disabilities participate and meet their everyday living needs. So reimagining what is possible, I thought, was a very appropriate subtitle. So let's go to the next slide, please. And so I'm going to talk, hopefully not more than 30 minutes, so we'll have time for some questions and answers. But what I thought I would do in this presentation is, first of all, just share some basic information on what we know about disability in Canada. And here I'll just be reporting on some research done by Statistics Canada in particular. Then I'll get to the heart of the topic, which Angela mentioned in her introductory remarks. First of all, just more generally, what is a model? When we talk about what are models in the social sciences or in research or in theory, and what do they actually do? What's the point of having models? And then I want to turn and look more specifically at three models of disability that are in the literature. And in order there, one is the charitable or charitable institutional model of disability. Second one is sometimes it's called the medical model, but I'm going to call it the medical rehabilitation model, because that, I think, encompasses a fair degree of what is meant by that model. And the third model is sometimes just called the social model, but again, I want to link it to the notion of human rights, and that people with disabilities are citizens and are holders of rights and responsibilities in Canadian society. So those are the three models I'll look at, and then kind of ask the question, well, where are we now in Canadian society with respect to these three models? What's actually going on today? And then I'll open it up to some discussion and questions and answers from our audience. So again, if we go to the next slide, please, Angela, that'd be great. So just turning first of all to some statistics or basic information on disability in Canada. The most recent survey that was done nationally on the state of disability in Canada was back in 2017. Statistics Canada does a major survey every 5 years. So there's one actually being done this year right now, and but the most recent is this information. And it's a survey of Canadians who are over the age of 15. So it doesn't get at children and youth under 15. So there's a whole other group in our population that doesn't very regularly get surveyed or studied, which is rather unfortunate because it leaves out a lot of other important experiences and issues. But anyways, the survey looks at people who have self-identified in a survey as having some kind of long-term condition or a health-related issue or problem that impacts their ability to perform everyday activities of living in the community. And from that survey, 22% of Canadians over the age of 15 reported having at least one disability that had that impact in their lives. Quite a few identified having two or some as many as three. Some very small segment of the population currently might live simultaneously with 4, 5, or 6 disabilities. So we often refer to someone as a person with a disability in the singular. We're actually leaving out a real lived reality of many Canadians with disabilities that they have simultaneously 2 or 3 or more conditions or circumstances that impact their lives. Among men, 20% report having a disability, and among women, slightly higher, 24%. And those differences between men and women are evident across all age groups. So whether we're looking at young men and women, middle-aged or older, that gender difference is apparent right across the whole lifespan. And there's whole literature on maybe why that's the case. In total, that represents over 6 million Canadians as of 2017 who self-identified as having a disability. So right now we have a federal election going on in Canada, and various disability groups are active on Twitter or on other social media. And sometimes you'll see this reference saying, what are the politicians going to do for the over 6 million Canadians with disabilities? So they draw on this information to want to make the point that when we talk about issues around disability, this isn't just some small little group in our population. This is a significant segment of the population. And there's often the saying going, if you live long enough, you will acquire some disabilities in your life, particularly aging. We know particularly people. And if we go to the next slide, please, Angela, we'll get a little better understanding of that, of how disability does correlate with aging. So for youth aged 15 to 24, as Statistics Canada use that category, 13% of young people, or over 500,000, 540,000 people in that age category in this survey identified as having a disability. When you look at the working age population, people 25, so people that maybe have finished post-secondary education, college, university, they're now into a career probably, and their prime working years of 25 to 64 years old, 20% of that population, or 3.7 million Canadians in that category, identify as having one or more disabilities. If we turn to seniors, over 65 and over, 38%, or 2 million Canadians identify as having a disability. And if you look at people 75 or over, it's almost half, 47%. So we know we have an aging population, we have a growing population, but we also have an aging population in Canada, which means that the prevalence of disability or the rate of disability will continue to go up. So in 2017, Statistics Canada found it was 22%. So we can only imagine that in 2021, 2022, when the data start to come out, that number will possibly be 23, maybe 24%. One of the reasons also is it's a self-identification, is if people aren't as stigmatized or feel reluctant to disclose their disability, if public opinion continues to change and attitudes shift towards being actually not regarding it as a shameful condition, but as a neuro part of human diversity, and it's an identity, and people are actually proud of their identity as someone has a disability, we may see more people self-declaring or self-identifying than maybe 5 or 10 or 20 years ago. So that statistic is actually something that gets influenced by social and attitudinal conditions in our society. Next slide, please. And here I just wanted to show you quickly, when Statistics Canada does do surveys, they use 10 different categories or types of disabilities. And these are the 10 of them here listed, and they're kind of ranked in order of how prevalent they are, the most common. And the most likely are what is called pain-related. An example of that might be arthritis. And that's more likely, pain-related disabilities are more likely reported among women than men, and more likely reported by older Canadians than younger Canadians. So again, it might correlate with what some people might just call aging or getting old, and my body is getting creaks and conditions. Might be chronic pain. Notice flexibility, mobility are kind of related to these abilities. Then mental health related disabilities. Most people who report having a mental health disability also report having a pain-related disability. So you start to see how some people have multiple. 7% of the population, but that still works out to 2 million Canadians identifying as having mental health related conditions. This could be anxiety, depression, severe stress disorder, or PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, bipolar disorders, anorexia nervosa, a whole host of, and this is an area that's still, there's a great deal of stigma, shame, and struggle around, particularly others perhaps more familiar. When you ask a Canadian, what comes to your mind when you think of someone with a disability? Often people refer to, well, someone who's visually impaired or blind and has a white cane or has a guide dog or a service dog. There's 1.5 million Canadians who identify as having some visual impairment. And then you've got hearing, deaf or hard of hearing, loss of hearing. Again, about almost 1.5 million Canadians here. And it's interesting, 1 in 3 of people who identify as having a hearing disability also have a seeing disability. So there's, again, a co-occurrence of disabilities there, both sight and hearing. Then you see down learning, memory, and developmental disabilities. These are more ones that relate to cognitive processes of thinking, reasoning, judgment, remembering, problem solving. And these are often less visible, what we often call hidden disabilities, in that it might not be readily apparent by just looking at the person that, oh, they're disabled. Whereas if you saw someone, certainly someone with a guide dog, for example, or a service dog, or someone in a wheelchair, you would say, oh, you immediately kind of come to a conclusion about the person. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Just a couple more slides to give you some background or general information. The lived experience of having a disability is conditioned by a number of factors. One of them is the severity of what the condition or the circumstances are that the person has. And again, going back to this 2017 survey, of the 6.2 million adults in Canada who self-identified as having disabilities, just over half described having a milder disability. That is, they were offered a choice on a questionnaire, and they either indicated they had what they considered to be a mild disability or a moderate disability. In other words, that they did not have as great a restrictions or limitations on their ability to engage in activities of daily life. People who said they had a more severe or very severe disability or condition, 43% of Canadians who self-identify. And so these are people who often would have multiple disabilities. The intensity and complexity of those disabilities would be greater. And the needs or service supports that they required perhaps would be much greater. And when we look at the data and we see what kind of life circumstances and living conditions people have milder compared to the more severe, we find that many Canadians with milder disabilities are more likely to have higher education. In other words, they were not only able to complete high school, but they went on to some post-secondary education, a college, an institute, university education. People with milder disabilities are more likely than people with more severe disabilities to be in the labor force and to have full-time or at least part-time employment or careers. And as a result of that, they tend to have higher incomes. Their poverty rates are not as severe or significant or serious as Canadians with more severe disabilities or conditions. So, and a lot of the programs that we have in Canada use a definition of severity of some kind to determine eligibility. So often when people, they'll perhaps when they're looking for supports or services, they may be told they're not eligible, they don't qualify. Well, but they'll say, but I have a disability. Yes, but it's not of a severe degree to the tests or conditions or the assessments, whether that's around IQ or dexterity or memory or what have you. And there's a whole host of different programs at the federal government level and at the different provinces. And it can be very confusing and also frustrating for people to say, well, I qualify for this program, but you're telling me I'm not disabled enough for this program or this service. And so there's a push by many groups, family groups and other groups, to move towards a more standardized and more inclusive definitions of what disability are. So people don't feel like they're being discriminated against, ignored, excluded, or prevented from getting their basic needs met in Canadian society. Okay, if we can go to the next slide. And then we'll get to the models, because I know that's the part Angela really wants to get to. So I asked the question here, is disability a well-established fact in Canada? So I've just been talking about a lot of numbers and statistics, but the paradox is that, yes, we do some research and statistics in Canada, but if it was a well-established fact or reality, wouldn't that mean that everyone or most people in Canada know about disability and have familiarity and are well informed about disability issues in Canada? And unfortunately, I don't think that's the case. I don't think Canadians have a high level of literacy or understanding about disability in general. First of all, that survey that I talked about, it's only done once every 5 years. So, and it's only done on adults. So we don't have a lot of recent data or statistics or information. It tends to get outdated very quickly. We often don't do regular surveys of Indigenous peoples or life on First Nations or in the Canadian North in the territories. So there's whole groups of people that are routinely not counted. They're discounted, in fact. And secondly, not all disabilities, as I've already suggested, are apparent to people or are permanent or stable. A number of people have what are less visible or sometimes hidden disabilities, or they have more episodic conditions. That might be you have diabetes, you have epilepsy, you might have chronic pain, you have Crohn's disease, you might have brain injury, which may not be readily apparent to people, which then raises the question of putting the burden on people to have to disclose or come out with their impairment. And do you share it with your colleagues? Do you share it with your employer? Do you share it, with your friends or family? And because again, that how will that impact your relationships with people? And that there's a fascinating literature and a discussion on that. People with disabilities as individuals and as communities have histories which have often not been well told in Canada. In many ways, and I'm not exactly comparing these as equal, but the recent history of residential schools for Indigenous children in this country has really shone a light on a history that was well known by elders and Indigenous community leaders, but that the general Canadian public was largely ignorant about, or had not been taught about, or had chosen to ignore or forget. There's a history of people with disabilities in this country, particularly those who were institutionalized, that were in asylums and in large facilities, some of which were only closed as recently in the 1990s, and or family members who were sent away, were not talked about. In a certain part of the 20th century, young women with disabilities who were sterilized because their parents were told it was the best thing for their daughters to do. So we had enforced sterilization. We've got some very dark chapters in the history of disability in this country. But again, I don't think most Canadians know it or appreciate it. But it's at times a very painful history that again, fortunately, some students and family members and historians and sociologists and others are writing about it, bringing it more to the attention of the public. And my last point here is about public acceptance of disability. I call it ambivalence because on the one hand, I think Canadians, when they're asked, they will acknowledge, yeah, there's someone in my family who has a disability, or I myself have one, or whatever. And they have a general view that there are services out there, there are programs, there are supports. We have the Charter of Rights, we have universal health care, we've got good programs. But on the same time, there's large ignorance on the part of many people about the gaps in our programs and the long wait lists, and that many services are time limited, and that people experience discrimination and stigma in their lives. And so that on the one hand, Canadians may have a fairly positive general view of what they think the state of disability and disability life is like in Canada, but they really don't have a deeper understanding of challenges and struggles and the policy barriers. So let's move to the models now, Angela. We'll get to our next slide. And first of all, just briefly, what's a model in general? It's just, I don't want to make it sound too fancy. Let's cut the jargon and just, it's a way of thinking about stuff. It's a way about describing something. And also to remember that any model is always partial, because a model by definition is about simplifying complexities and highlighting key features that a particular person who's making up the model or using the model, they want to bring to the forefront. They want to draw our attention to certain features of reality and get us to think about those. But by doing that, they leave other things out, and that's a choice. But we should always remember that any model highlights certain things, but then also ignores or omits or downplays other things. And we just need to know that. So models are ways of interpreting and seeing, thinking about people and Canadian society, the role of our governments, and the role of other organizations, whether those are families, businesses, unions, professional associations, foundations, you name it. So let's move on to our next slide, please. And here I just want to, before we get into the three specific models in particular, talk a bit about what are models for, and what do they actually do? Well, in the disability literature, the disability field, what models of disability do are several things here. First, they depict impairments or activity limitations or disabilities in a certain way. They highlight them, and we'll get to that in a minute. So when models, do they focus on the individual? Do they focus on a particular part of an individual? Do they locate the disability in a broader context? Do they portray it in a positive way or a negative way? There's a number of features that the models have that we need to be aware of. And with that is the second one is, with that comes an image of disabled people. Are they seen in a positive way? Or is there a shroud of shame or regret or even fear and tragedy that is surrounded by the way we look and even talk about disability or people with disabilities? And then models also tend to suggest, what do we do about it? So what? What should be done? And each model either very explicitly, sometimes implicitly, suggests different ways society should respond, what kind of interventions or ways of taking action to help meet needs or address the concerns and challenges of people living with disabilities. And because of that, a fourth thing that models of disability do is they matter for citizenship. That's a big word, but what it really means is, what do these models say about people's rights and their responsibilities and their sense of belonging in a community? And do they feel that they're included or excluded? Do they feel that there's ability to participate or not? So every model that we might talk about has those kinds of consequences or implications for participation, social inclusion. And finally, each of these models has a history of its own. They've come from somewhere, and they have a history. Some have a longer history than others, as we'll show in a minute. They also have a current reality, and they may have a future. And so just there's a time dimension to these models that we need to think about. So if we go to the next slide, this just gives you a quick overview of the three models we're going to look at. And these are presented in order of when they appeared or how they've been formulated in many societies, including Canada, United States. These models get talked about in Britain, in Europe, Australia, New Zealand, a number of countries around the world. And so the oldest one would be the charitable model. And then, obviously the medical rehab model is one that emerged through the 19th century into the 20th and now the 21st century. And then the social human rights model is one that's more from about the mid 20th century onwards into this century. So they've each got slightly different histories. Some are much older than others. So I could say there are other models in the literature, and Angela Crowell already knew that. But I wanted to talk about three that to me are maybe they're the three biggest or most significant. But anyways, let's turn to our next slide and look at our first model, the charitable or institutional model. And here, disability is understood as historically as a personal tragedy. It was a case of bad luck or a personal misfortune, and also largely a family responsibility. At times when we started to, in the 17th or 18th centuries and into the 19th century, when there became more beyond the family, you saw charities get involved, churches, other faith-based organizations, and the disabled were considered often what sometimes is called the worthy or deserving poor. We had other people who were poor in society who maybe weren't deemed as deserving, because we often thought, well, it's their own fault for whatever reason. They're unemployed, they're idle, they're lazy, they're drunks, whatever. But often say, if someone obviously had a physical impairment or disability, you'd say, well, that's really through no fault of their own. And these people are more deserving of our help than other people. So often disabled people got portrayed as objects of pity or deserving charity, sometimes feared as unpredictable, their behavior perhaps erratic or seen as something irregular or abnormal, but still at times seen as deserving of some support or supervision. So government responses historically have been around local welfare, people with more significant or severe disabilities placed in asylums for what would then be called feeble-minded or imbeciles, or even the term idiots and morons. These were terms actually used by psychologists and early physicians. These were diagnostic labels. These were not just words that were painful in language. Although even the word retarded, which now is a very controversial and undesirable and hurtful term, was used, that people were seen as having mental retardation. So the response often was separation, segregation, seclusion of people in other facilities outside of the mainstream of society. And the next slide just shows you a couple of images of the charitable or institutional model of disability. It's relying on donations, contributions through either church or charities, and often seen as for the poor boxes. And the idea that there were rights or citizenship, really not part of the vocabulary. The language was about people had, the disability was very much centered in the individual, and it was seen as a tragedy. if you're ever familiar with the Charles Dickens story about A Christmas Carol, or ever seen a movie about the Christmas Carol, Tiny Tim and his family, Tiny Tim was a cripple with a cane, and at the end of the story, it was good old Ebenezer Scrooge who had a conversion and suddenly became much more generous. But it's still about personal tragedy and a family having to really meet the needs with very little assistance outside of the family. That really was Dickens' England of the 1860s, 1870s. And so the charitable institutional model really kind of reflects what sometimes might be called a Dickensian view of the world, for those of you who know your Charles Dickens. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Many people would call this is the most dominant model of disability in practice. And again, it emerged in the, particularly in the latter part of the 19th century, but certainly the 20th century and into the 21st century. This is a prominent way of thinking about and responding to people with disability. Diagnosing people as having a bodily condition of some kind or cognitive, an illness, particularly a serious one, an injury, a mental disorder, or having a special need. Like the charitable model, the focus here too is still on the individual, still on their body and on their mind. What's going on inside a person? And the disabled person acquires an identity or a label as a patient or a client who needs help, needs a treatment. Perhaps there's a therapeutic cure, or there's a clinical diagnosis or pharmaceutical management. So where the role of medications and drugs for helping people with their condition to manage it. There's in the disability model that's called the medical model, the major players or participants in this are healthcare related professions, whether that's physicians or surgeons or nurses. But also when we think about rehabilitation services, we think about physiotherapists or occupational therapists, massage therapists, chiropractic treatments. If we think of more on the mental health side, we start to think of psychiatrists and psychologists and psychotherapists, or maybe even psychiatric social workers. So we start to see that all of these professions that had grown through the 20th century and into the 21st century have a very close link to disability, whether that's mental health or physical disability or what have you. And the pharmaceutical industry as well as medical healthcare. Focus here is often, some people will say in the disability community, it's on fixing me or correcting me, or relieving me and assisting me. But sometimes it's like I was seen as broken. I had a deficit, I had a gap, and they were going to either treat me, cure me, fix me, which again is not a language that is often so positive for some people as to their own self-esteem, their identity. And if you look at the next slide, it just gives you a couple of quick images of looking at the human body. The disability is about focusing on the inner workings, the different systems, and rehabilitation, assisting someone. And this is just going to give you a couple of examples. So let's move on to the social model, social human rights model. And this came about really very much influenced at the end of World War II. And partly as a reaction to the horrors and the genocide of World War II, which included genocide towards disabled people. The Holocaust that was perpetrated by Nazi Germany focused primarily on Jews, the extermination of Jewish people, but it also targeted homosexuals, gypsies, and the disabled. And so there was a program of eugenics that not just happened in Germany, but in other countries too, including Canada, of purifying the human race of people with defects. you'll still hear people talk about eugenics in the disability community. Again, part of the terrible history. Out of that, at the end of World War II and the founding of the United Nations and the talking about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for all peoples and the right for self-determination and the fundamental importance of human dignity and human decency, those aspirations that very much influenced, even before the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 70s in the United States for African Americans. It started often with mothers who had children with developmental or intellectual disabilities in the 1950s, wanting their children, their sons or daughters, to be able to go to their local public schools and not get shunted away in segregated institutions. That's, in Canada, that's some of the early beginnings of the social model, the right to belong, the right to participate in mainstream society. And the influence, as I say, out of World War II and the founding United Nations, this notion of human rights, universal human rights. And so that continued and really accelerated in Canada in the 1970s and onwards. And the argument here, the key idea of the social model is here in bold, that yes, people may be born or acquire later in their life certain bodily impairments, spinal cord injury, traumatic brain injury, they might have arthritis, an accident, a condition that comes on because of some genetic predisposition, what have you, aging. But the problems one experiences in trying to participate in everyday life is not simply because of the bodily condition. It's because society has put up barriers and has perpetuated gaps in services. And whether that's physical barriers in the built environment, or it's attitudinal barriers in people's beliefs and assumptions about what people can and cannot do, and cultural attitudes, and who gets represented in popular Hollywood movies and who doesn't, who do you see in society being represented? Technological barriers. Every new technology, whether it's Zoom meetings, the internet, the telephone, the radio, television, they have mixed blessings. They bring new opportunities, but they also carry with them obstacles and barriers for access. And public policies and laws and public programs and services, depending on how they're designed and delivered, also have their own barriers and obstacles in them. And so when you think about all those things collectively, attitudes, culture, built environment, laws, etc., you start to see that society itself is disabling. Society itself has barriers. And so that much of the limitations people face in their life isn't due to perhaps a physical condition, ultimately, as much as the lack of ramps or Braille or technologies, closed captioning, et cetera, et cetera. And so here's a list on this slide of some of the responses about what a social or a human rights model is about. It was about closing institutions. It was about deinstitution, getting people out of those large separate facilities so that they could live in community. So to live in community, they needed adequate community services. That's still an ongoing challenge to provide adequate, accessible, affordable services. Reasonable accommodations, meaning in the workplace, that you may need to provide some supports or aids or devices that are reasonable to ensure equal or equitable employment opportunities for people. Prohibition against discrimination. Universal design is the idea that in the built environment, we try to ensure that structures and processes can accommodate, whether that's an older person with a walker being able to navigate down sidewalks and crosswalks, or even a young mother with a toddler in a pram or a stroller, or a person in a wheelchair, or a person with a walking stick, or other. That if we think universal design, it's not just for people with disabilities. Suddenly it makes it more accessible for wider populations. Accessibility laws, try to remove barriers in society. So in the social human rights model, persons with disabilities are seen as citizens, as members of the community who hold rights like everybody else and hold responsibilities like everybody else. And and can and should have the opportunity to be full participating members in whatever community or communities they live in all aspects of life. That's the aspiration. So you can see that the social human rights model is very aspirational. It's not just descriptive about what is, it's very much about what should be and what could be in our society. So if we go to the next slide, I know I'm maybe going a little too long here. This, I just wanted to show a couple of images. The Accessible Canada Act was passed in 2019 by the Parliament of Canada. And the vision there, you might not be able to read it, says, proactively eliminate barriers and ensure greater opportunities for Canadians with disabilities. That's very much that human social rights model. Proactively eliminate barriers. That means a systemic, proactive approach rather than just waiting for people to complain and lodge a human rights case, which has to go one at a time, very slowly and painfully. This is to put the onus on governments and employers and other organizations in society to say, you have a duty to eliminate barriers. We shouldn't expect people to have to fight to get the barriers taken down. We need to do it systemically and proactively. And that's the aspiration behind the Accessible Canada Act. And I'm happy to say that in the parliament that sat between 2015 and 2019, the first Trudeau government, the first parliament, this was the only piece of legislation in those 4 years that all the political parties unanimously supported. This tells you that this isn't a partisan issue. Accessibility is a Canadian human rights issue, and all the parties supported that legislation. It was the only one. The Bloc, the Conservatives, the NDP, the Liberals, and the Green, they all supported it. So that's encouraging. One of the things that came out of that legislation is the establishment of a National Accessibility Awareness Week. And we just, whether you knew it or not, we just celebrated the second annual one back from May 30th to June the 5th. Every year it starts on the last Sunday of the month of May. And this was built into this legislation because it recognized, as Canadians with Disabilities told politicians, some of the barriers we face are attitudinal, ignorance, lack of awareness and understanding. We need to change that. We need culture change. It's not just about changing physical barriers, cutting curbs and putting in ramps or handles or bars or stuff like that. It's cultural as well as physical and technological. We need to shift away people's awareness and understanding. And so that was established 2 years ago from that legislation. And hopefully over the coming years, that will help to shift and raise awareness about a more human rights thinking and social community around disability. Okay, let's get on to the next one. Just a couple more slides, folks. Thank you for your patience. So this is kind of taking stock, saying, okay, Michael, you've shared with us these three models. They're kind of abstract, maybe in a bit of a way. So where are we right now in disability services and policy and thinking in this country? And I would say to you that all three models exist. They're real. They're not just concepts. They actually capture some parts of our reality, in our complex world. And the charitable model still exists because we know that charities and voluntary nonprofits still play a really important role in helping families and individuals with disabilities. Sometimes the only time someone might get a piece of equipment or assistive device or support, it's not from government, it'll be coming from a charity. And if it wasn't for that charity or fundraiser, the need would be unmet and the person would be struggling. So, and some of this times, you might think this is essential medical equipment. You say, gosh, isn't this covered by Medicare or the health system? And surprisingly, no. A lot of the times people's needs still have to be met through families doing crowdsourcing online. We still see that in Canada. To me, that's an example of the charitable model. Or people saying, hey, my son or daughter needs a certain kind of drug and it's not covered by the healthcare plan and it's going to cost tens of thousands of dollars. And people do fundraisers. Or they go to their local service charity groups or foundations or United Ways and ask for help. Well, to me, that tells me that the charitable model is still alive and well and flourishing, but also in a good way. I don't want to just say it's in a bad way. It's in a good way too. Families themselves and disabled people themselves are assumed and expected to still play a very important role. And a good example is in home care and home support and personal care on assisted living. So families still incur large out-of-pocket expenses. They do not get tax credits or subsidies or funds all the time for what many Canadians would say, wow, that to me seems like a pretty essential basic need. I would have thought there would be a public program for you. And families will say, no, or we don't qualify, or there's a wait list, or we do get a bit of money, but it only covers a fraction of the needs, so that families are out of. What often that means is that one of the parents, if it's a two-couple household, has to quit the job or cut back and start to work part-time to devote more time to personal care of a family member in the household. And then that has an impact on the financial well-being and economic security of the family when there's not the same kind of income going into the house. The medical model, of course, is pretty obvious. I don't think I need to point out that that's, but healthcare services and medical definitions of eligibility are quite prevalent in how people qualify for programs for many services. On the social model, human rights model, my last point here is, I think I would say that we can see that there's been some progress made over the last generation or two. When I talk to some of the elders of the disability movement who lived through the 1950s and 60s, and they remind me of where we are today compared to then. There's still a long way to go, but they remind us about the progress that has been made. And we need to acknowledge that, and that needs to be celebrated by families and parent groups and advocates. We have seen some improvements, and but there's still lots of work to do. So the next slide is really to turn it over to the audience, I guess. Angela, I don't know how we want to moderate this, and if people have any questions or comments or points of clarification. I covered a lot of material there. I know, I appreciate that. And you've been patient, but here's a chance with about 10 minutes or so, I guess, for Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you, Professor Prince, for that wonderful lesson. I'm like taking a little bit of notes while this is going on. Yeah, we'll open it up. Debbie, I see that you're unmuted and have your video on if you have a question.
Yeah, no, I enjoyed it. Yeah, I don't have any questions here. I think I know it all, heard it all.
Okay.
So, I have a question then, because
Sure.
So there are the three models, and then the statistics you gave at the beginning. I guess my question would be, how does the perception of the different models differ for people who have acquired disabilities versus genetic or are born with a disability? So I feel like from what I have seen in my personal experience, it feels very different. I feel like for people who acquire, it's a little bit more of that charitable model.
Yeah, that's a good question. When and how do people acquire a disability in Canada? It really can shape your life circumstances from then on, and your identity. Mm-hmm. I'll just mention Rick Hansen as an example of someone who acquired a spinal cord injury at, I think, around the age of 18 or 19. Mm-hmm. So people who acquire, and that's often people who, many, if not most people with spinal cord injury are men, not women. There's quite a clear, it's usually from sporting accidents or other kinds of physical activities, car accidents, and it's often they're in their late teens or in their 20s. And so there's a very kind of specific profile for different kinds of condition. That tells me that if that's your experience, it means you were able to go to elementary school and high school and you weren't disabled. and you probably you acquired other life skills and maybe work experience with summer jobs and friends and a whole, participation, that if, say, you were born with, say, a Down syndrome or autism, or another genetic or other fetal alcohol syndrome disorder, where right from the beginning of your life, your parents get told your new son or daughter is, quote, disabled. You may be told that they probably won't go to school. You probably may be told that they will forever be at a cognitive level of a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, which can be very devastating and damning. And time again, I've heard parents tell me those kinds of stories. What should have been a joyful time of birth and new life, they have a medical specialist tell them everything that's wrong with their child and a very bleak future. And years later, they'll share stories like that with anger and emotion. But they'll also say it with pride, because they'll say, my daughter went to school. My daughter has a job and thrived. And she has so many gifts. And we have learned so much from her. And she is an active member. So you're quite right, Angela. Another story or example I would give is for someone who acquires an injury at the workplace, it may mean that therefore they may be unemployed, but depending on when it happened, maybe in their 30s or 40s, they have a workplace accident or they develop a condition where they're no longer, but if the disability can be linked back to the workplace, then that probably means they'll be eligible for workers' compensation. WorkSafe BC. And that may likely then mean you have access to income support, health benefits, rehabilitation services from a program that has existed in Canada since the early 20th century and is one of the most generous. Doesn't mean it's adequate or super duper, but someone who gets disabled and goes on workers' comp is better off than someone who is disabled and relies on social assistance or welfare.
Yeah.
Someone who gets disabled, who never had any employment history, they're ineligible for Canada Pension Plan disability. If you're a veteran in the armed forces and you become disabled, there are veterans programs that are better than programs for non-civilian Canadians, non-veterans. And so who you are and how you get disabled and where you get disabled and when you get disabled all have really important implications for your own identity, your own ability to have connected with society, and what kinds of services and supports may be available to you because of the circumstances around when. So you're absolutely right. There's again, it's like talking about seniors or Indigenous peoples or immigrants. You cannot generalize. We cannot lump everybody in and say, oh, the disabled, it's a group with tremendous diversities. There are some shared, very common experiences around discrimination, stigma, often poverty, challenges in finding work. But you have to qualify it sometimes with, well, is it a mild disability or a severe disability? Are we talking about someone who acquired it later in life or born with it or as a teenager or as a 62-year-old, whatever. So we need to know each person's story. So we need to kind of listen and learn, but be aware that there's a lot of challenges across the different experiences. But so thank you. That could have been a slide in itself. Acquired versus when is the onset of the disability, and then the nature of the disability is also quite important. Yeah.
I also had. Well, first, if anyone else has any questions before I take all of the time.
That's okay.
Go ahead, Angela.
So my older sister is hard of hearing, and I grew up in the United States. I want to give that context because, as you kind of said, Canada, the perception of disability in Canada seems to be better comparatively to some other places. And growing up with her, she always really hated the word disabled. I guess that kind of falls into kind of the medical model where it's seen as something is wrong with you. I guess I kind of wanted to hear your thoughts on that topic because I know that it's a controversial kind of back and forth.
Yeah, well, and again, it's not unique to this community. You know, whether we talk about different other social groups and social movements over time have all debated language, whether it's feminists, African Americans, or Black Americans or Black Canadians, whether it's ethnic racial groups, whether it's environmentalists even argue as to what they should call each other or call themselves. So, you know, the language matters. That's really the bottom line. And you're right. And it varies across country. And it even varies even here in BC. I work with a number of self-advocates who choose to and prefer the term a person with a diverse ability. So diverse abilities. Trying to get at the idea that, you know, we as humans, we are on a continuum or a spectrum of diverse abilities, gifts. We all face limitations, and we are interdependent. And there's no shame in acknowledging. But we live in a culture largely that prizes independence, autonomy, the idea of choice, and doing it on your own, pulling your bootstraps up. And the United States is even more so, right? Stronger culture of individualism. But we have it here in Canada very much as well. But the idea of diverse abilities tries to promote more the idea of variety is normal. And interdependence is normal, not abnormal. Then there's people who are quite comfortable saying, I'm a disabled person. And that's the preferred language in the United Kingdom. So in Great Britain, you will see activists talk about the disabled people. So in some groups, if I use that term here, many people will flinch or get angry at me and say, well, that's not the right way to talk, Michael. And we prefer to be called persons with a disability, and it's called people first language, right? Put the person first, and then don't call me disabled or handicapped or blind or deaf, or don't label me with the condition. You know, refer to me first and foremost as a person, and then you might say with a disability. So those are at least three, disabled person, person with a disability, person with a diverse ability, other people. So again, one of my friends, an Indigenous friend, said, just ask me what I want to be called. Whether I want to be called First Nation, status Indian, Indigenous person, Aboriginal, because again, often that will discourage conversations, right? And if there's not a conversation, it inhibits understanding, and it inhibits the possibilities of alliances and coalitions and having allies. And every social movement needs coalitions and allies. And part of that, to facilitate that, has to be people feeling comfortable and willing to engage in conversations. And if they start thinking, I don't know what words to use, then we get silence. And if we have silence, that perpetuates the barriers and the obstacles and isolates. So there's a variety of, and the terminology is changing and shifting. But, it was interesting. I was just looking with this federal election, looking at some of the political party platforms, and some, we'll just refer to Canadians with disabilities. They just want to, that's a safe phrase. And you'll see in the language of the platforms, particularly in two of the parties, they talk about addressing barriers. So the concept of barriers is very much in the language of the political parties' platforms now. So that tells me that the social model is, has seeped in to the vocabulary and thinking of at least some politicians and political parties. And they know that if they want to connect with the disabled or disability as voters, they better speak a language that resonates and
Use all the buzzwords.
yeah, use the buzz. Yeah, at one level it could be just seen as political buzzwords, but you might also think it's an attempt to connect. And why are they trying? Because they want the votes. So, and it's like businesses realizing if they want consumers, they want people or they want employees, if they want people to be working for them or to buy their services, how do we reach out to, I was at a workshop once with a vice president of one of the major banks in the country and she said, why would we ignore 20% of the population? He said, as a business, it doesn't make sense. As a bank, why would I ignore 20% of the potential business for my bank? Right? Now, that doesn't sound very altruistic. It's not charitable, but it's a different model of disability. It's thinking about it in economic terms or business terms, and that's a different model altogether. That's viewing people with disabilities not so much as citizens, but as potential customers, consumers, contributors, employees. It's looking at capacity, but in a different way, than talking about rights and citizenship. But again, it's a powerful model too in our society to frame things in terms of the economics. To say to people, this isn't just charity. I'm not telling you to do this because it's just the right thing to do. It makes sense both for you and for the person, and so there's a kind of reciprocity, and there's kind of a logic there that a lot of people hear that more than they'd hear about rights or medicine or charity. They go, oh, okay, I feel comfortable about that model. I like that model. There you go.
Yeah, whatever gets people to do the thing, I guess.
Well, I say to my students, if you're advocating, know who your audience is and what will they hear. And if it's the medical model, fine. If it's a rehab model, fine. If it's more social or human rights, fine. Some groups, they hear the word rights, they'll tune out on me. So I go, okay, I think I need to connect with them. How do I advance their understanding? How do I get them engaged in the conversation? And again, I think that's just advocacy 101. It's know who you're speaking to and try to find some common ground, and to move it.
Yeah, and in our group of the paraplegic and quadriplegics, it's physically challenged now.
Oh, okay. Is that it, Debbie? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. And again, and that's a good example. You need to ask the people you're working with or meeting with, say, what's the lingo? I don't want to offend. I don't want to insult, and out of respect, I just want to know what's the terminology. And the fact that you ask the question should tell someone like Debbie, you've thought about this is something I need to know about. This is important, and not just make an assumption.
Well, it's the same as what applying for jobs. How do I tell that employer that I need some barriers removed, right? That's where I came up with a physically challenged.
That's definitely less intimidating than disabled.
And I didn't want to say I'm handicapped. I hated that word, but disability, I didn't have a problem with any of the other ones, but the physically challenged was pretty good for everybody. Even your sister, she's physically challenged if she can't see some things, right?
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for answering my questions. Those are the ones that are on top of my head. I'll give one quick call for any other questions. Going once, going twice. Awesome. Well, thank you, Dr. Dr. Professor, I'm not sure.
You can call me either. And let's just go to the last slide. There is a slide number 19. And that was just to say thank you to all of you. and for those, I'm delighted to know, Angela, that this is recorded and other people will be able to see this and you can replay it. And it's been a real thrill. Thank you very much. I really appreciate you reaching out to me, and congratulations to you and all the people at Connector Society and the Disability Foundation for all your good work too. And it's nice to get the message out and to meet kindred spirit.
Awesome. And then thank you for speaking. It's amazing to learn more about this.
Okay. Thank you. Okay.
Have a wonderful long weekend, everybody.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.